The day I asked my children to buy me a little food, they told me to eat less. The moment I heard that, my heart tightened. What they didn't know was that just a few days earlier, I had been informed that I was about to inherit nearly $4 million. I still remember that feeling. A little surprise, a little sadness, and a kind of pain settling in my chest that I couldn't put into words. When you need someone the most and they're not there for you, that feeling lingers. If you've ever experienced something similar, you'll likely understand the story I'm about to share. Before I tell you everything that happened, I have a question for you. Where are you listening from? It truly warms my heart to know someone is here with me for these everyday stories. And if you enjoy genuine, gentle stories that reveal quiet things beneath the surface to ponder, you can follow the channel so you won't miss the next episodes. Now then, let me tell you the whole story that changed my life and the way I look at my children. My name is Helen Walker, and I'm 68 years old. I live alone in a small 2-bedroom house in a town in northern Pennsylvania. My husband and I bought this house more than 30 years ago, back when we were young and full of energy. He passed away 4 years ago, leaving me with an old house, many memories, and an emptiness that isn't easy to fill. My life is far from luxurious. My income comes mainly from senior benefits and a small pension. Medicine costs keep rising with age. I always try to manage within my means, but everything gets harder as time goes by. I recall one morning not long ago when I visited the supermarket. I held just a few basic items, eggs, bread, and a small pack of meat. When I reached the checkout counter, I realized I was a few dollars short. I felt so embarrassed that I wanted to walk out. In the end, I had to return the meat. That night, I ate bread with butter. Not delicious, but enough to get by. My house is always colder than usual. Winters here are harsh, but I'm afraid to turn the heat up. I keep the thermostat set low to conserve electricity. Some nights, I cover myself with 2 blankets and still feel cold. But when I think of next month's bill, all I can do is pull the blanket higher. My car is ancient. Every time I start it, I silently pray for the engine to turn over. It has broken down many times, and each time means sleepless nights for me because of the cost. Sometimes I want to go somewhere just for a change of scenery, but thinking about the car dying in the middle of the road makes me stay home. Living alone at this age isn't easy. Mornings can be so quiet that I can hear the clock ticking. At night, sometimes the only sound is the wind whistling through the old windows. I don't complain, but the loneliness sometimes makes me wish someone would ask how I'm doing. Just one simple question, "Mom, are you okay?" would be enough to warm my heart. And in that situation, the careless words of my 3 children made me feel smaller and more lost than ever. I have 3 children. They are all grown up with stable jobs and families of their own. From the outside, anyone would think I must be very proud and happy. And honestly, in my heart, I love them more than anything. But as they grew older, they became busier and stopped noticing the small things around them. My oldest son is Mark, 42. He works as a real estate agent and is always racing after his job. He loves showing off online, from selling a new house to dining at fancy restaurants. Last week, he posted a picture of a giant fish tank he had just installed in his living room, with colorful lights shining through it. Mark lives fast, always in a hurry. He's not a bad person, he just tends to overlook other people's feelings, including his mother's. The second one is Rachel, 40 years old. She works as a medical assistant at a clinic in the city. She's hardworking and the best at managing money among the 3, but because of that, she can be a little rigid. She often talks about saving and budgeting. Recently, Rachel showcased her newly renovated kitchen, which features light wood cabinets and shiny countertops. I was genuinely happy for her. She worked hard for her comfortable life. However, her firmness sometimes causes her to say things that sting others without her realizing it. And the youngest is Evan, 38. He owns a small but successful tax consulting office. Among the 3, Evan is the gentlest and the quietest. However, he's somewhat too influenced by his wife in many matters. Young couples have their own ways of thinking. I understand that. Still, I sometimes wish Evan could stand on his own more, especially when it comes to family matters. Last week, Evan posted a picture of himself driving the new yacht he bought. Seeing his bright smile made me both happy and a little distant. All three of them are successful and far better off financially than I am. They're not bad people, and they don't intentionally hurt anyone. They're just busy, caught up in their own families and responsibilities, and they've slowly forgotten that their mother is also a person who's getting older every day, someone who sometimes just needs a little care. That afternoon, I sat alone in the kitchen. It was cold outside, the light was dim, and the house was so quiet I could hear the weak hum of the refrigerator. I opened the cabinet and looked inside. There was only a little butter left, a few canned goods, and half a stale loaf of bread. Not enough for the next few days. I stood there for a long moment, my hand still holding the cabinet door open, feeling as heavy as if someone had hung stones inside my chest. I knew I had no other choice. I needed some food to get by until my next benefit payment. I went to the living room and picked up my phone. I opened my contacts and saw Mark's name, then Rachel's, then Evan's. 3 familiar names I had called my whole life. I was about to dial, but stopped. I put the phone down on the table. A moment later, I picked it up again, then set it down once more. I told myself, they're so busy. They're probably taking care of their kids, their work, their own lives right now. Another moment passed, and I thought, I don't want to bother them. I've always tried to take care of myself. But when I turned back and saw the empty refrigerator, my heart clenched. I remembered what my husband used to say when he was alive. Whatever happens, tell the kids. Don't keep it inside. However, for many years, I had grown accustomed to enduring things on my own. I looked at the phone again, my hand trembling slightly. Inside me was both hope and fear. I hope that my children will say something warm, and fear that they would feel bothered, or worse, that they wouldn't care. After nearly an hour of hesitation, I finally took a deep breath and made the call. In that moment, I wished for one straightforward thing, to hear a gentle voice asking if I was okay. I called Mark first. The phone rang several times before someone picked up. It was Claire, his wife. In the background, I heard loud laughter and the clinking of dishes, sounding like they were having a small gathering at home. Claire babbled, "Hold on a sec, Mom, I'll call Mark." I heard footsteps, then the music grew a bit louder. Mark finally spoke. "Mom, what's going on? We have people over right now." I swallowed, trying to sound calm. "I just wanted to ask if you could get me a little food. I'm a bit short this week." Mark cut me off before I could finish. "Mom, try eating less to save money. You know how expensive everything is now. And don't buy anything pricey, okay?" I stayed silent for a few seconds. I didn't ask for much, just hoped he would ask, "Are you okay, Mom?" But that question never came. "All right then, Mom. I have to get back to our guests." The call ended. I stared at the screen. It lasted only a few dozen seconds, but it was enough to make my chest feel like something heavy was pressed against it. The house suddenly felt suffocating, even though no one was there but me. I called Rachel next. Her voice came quickly, sounding a bit rushed. "Mom, I'm checking the schedule for our beach trip with Tom and the kids." "What's going on?" I spoke honestly. "I have very little money left, dear. I just need some food to get through the weekend." Rachel replied immediately, as if the answer had already been waiting on her tongue. "Mom, stop buying convenience food. Cook something cheap. It saves money. Those ready-made things cost too much." Her voice wasn't loud or annoyed, but colder than I remembered. She used to talk to me with gentleness, like a breeze. Now it felt like she was speaking to a stranger. I softly said, "I understand." Rachel added one more sentence before hanging up quickly. "I'm busy right now. Talk later, Mom." I put the phone down. In my head, her voice echoed. The same voice that used to be my comfort. I didn't know why, but at that moment I felt strangely hollow inside. It took me a while to calm down enough to call Evan. He picked up rather quickly. "What do you need, Mom? I'm reviewing the month-end reports." I tried to speak clearly, though my throat tightened. "I just need a little food. My account is running low." Evan exhaled slowly. "Mom, you need to control your spending. You buy unnecessary things. At your age, you have to plan every expense." Right then, I heard Evan's wife's voice in the background. "She can just eat less. Older people don't need much food." Hearing that felt like someone drove something sharp right through my heart, not because the words were cruel, but because of the carelessness in their tone. They sounded as if my lack of food was my own fault, rather than because I was genuinely struggling. All I could manage to say was, "Okay, I understand." I hung up. I sat quietly in the living room for a long time, without turning on the lights, without saying anything. It was already dark outside, but I remained there, listening to the clock tick each second. I didn't feel angry, only a deep sadness, as if something had just fallen into the space between my children and me. After the 3 calls, I sat still in the living room, my hand resting on the phone. In the silence, old memories suddenly returned, clear as if they had happened yesterday. I remembered Mark when he was 7 years old. He once had such a high fever that his face turned red and his body trembled. That night, I didn't dare close my eyes. I placed warm cloths on his forehead, checked his temperature frequently, and stayed by his bedside all night. My husband had to work the night shift, so it was just the 2 of us. By morning, Mark's fever had started to subside. He opened his eyes, looked at me, and said simply, "Mom, don't fall asleep." I smiled as tears ran down my cheeks. I remembered Rachel, too. When she was in 6th grade, the school held a year-end performance. Rachel was chosen for a dance and needed to rent a costume. We were struggling badly then, but she was so excited I couldn't bring myself to say no. I went from store to store, asking prices everywhere, looking for the cheapest outfit that still looked nice. When Rachel stepped onto the stage, her face lit up. I sat below, watching her dance, and my heart felt lighter than it had in years. And then Evan, the youngest. When he was 3, he was terrified of sleeping alone. Some nights he cried uncontrollably just because of the dark. I lay beside him every night, holding him until he fell asleep. Sometimes I fell asleep next to him, waking up with an aching back but still happy because he slept peacefully. Those memories aren't grand. They're just ordinary moments from a mother's life. But to me, they were everything. I raised them with everything I had. I never imagined there would come a day when I'd sit here, recalling every tiny moment and asking myself, how did the children I nurtured so carefully drift so far away from me? 3 days after those calls, I went outside to get the mail as usual. My mailbox usually only held a few flyers and bills. But that day, there was a white envelope, thicker than usual, with the name of a law office in Seattle printed on the front. I stood right at the door, holding the envelope with my heart pounding. I didn't know anyone in Seattle and had no business there. I went to the kitchen, sat down, and opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a short letter and a business card. The letter invited me to contact the office of attorney David Monroe about matters relating to the estate of Mr. Harold Whitman. I read that name several times. Harold Whitman. He was my father's older brother. I had only met him a few times when I was small. Later, he moved to the West Coast for work, and our family lost touch with him. I thought he had died long ago. It took me a moment to steady myself, then I called the number in the letter. A man with a clear, gentle voice answered. "Hello, Mrs. Helen Walker. I'm David Monroe, attorney for Mr. Harold Whitman. Do you have a moment to speak?" I replied softly. "Yes, but I'm a bit surprised." He went on to explain. Uncle Harold had died a few months earlier. In his will, he had named me as the heir to his estate. I could hardly believe it. I asked, "But I haven't been in contact with him. Why me?" Attorney Monroe spoke slowly, as if wanting me to understand every word. Mr. Harold did not keep in direct contact, but he watched over your family from afar. He knew about your life, that you cared for your husband, raised 3 children, and endured patiently despite many hardships. He stated in his will that he believed you had a steadfast and kind heart. I was silent for a long moment. It felt like something was lodged in my throat. Then he continued, "After taxes and expenses, the total value of the estate you will receive is approximately $3,900,000. I had to lean back in my chair. I thought I had misheard. In my whole life, I had never held anywhere near that amount of money. I asked again, almost whispering, "How much?" "About $3,900,000, and it's all yours." Tears came at once, not only because of the money, but because of the feeling of being remembered, trusted, and valued, things I had not felt from my 3 children for a very long time. I cried from relief and a sharp sense of sadness. The person who cared about me turned out to be someone I thought had forgotten me years ago, and the children I raised for so many years couldn't even offer me a timely word of concern. After the call with Attorney Monroe, I spent the whole afternoon thinking. Throughout my life, I had been accustomed to counting every penny, worrying about bills, and only buying what was necessary. And yet now, before me stood a completely different future. I knew I had to change my life, but to do so gradually, calmly, and deliberately. The next morning, I went grocery shopping. For the first time in many years, I didn't carry a detailed list of the cheapest items. I took a cart and walked down the aisles. I picked up a nice pack of meat, a fresh piece of salmon, and some vegetables that I had only looked at and passed by. I even took a carton of vanilla ice cream that I had always loved but considered a luxury. For the first time, I didn't look at the prices or do the math in my head. At the checkout, when the clerk announced the total, I simply nodded without hesitation. The feeling was strange, light and warm, like I could finally exhale after years of holding my breath. A few days later, I toured an apartment in a senior living community that people always said was clean, safe, and comfortable. A staff member walked me down bright hallways, showed me the standard room, a light exercise area, and a small library. The model apartment was bright, tidy, and cozy. The balcony overlooked a row of neat trees, calm and peaceful. When I stepped into the bedroom, it felt like entering another life. No more peeling walls, no more rattling old heater, just a simple space that made me feel worthy. I stood in that room for a long time, thinking I might finally be ready to start a new chapter. Then I decided to replace the old car that had exhausted me for years. I visited a dealership and selected a small, easy-to-drive silver car. My hands trembled a little as I held the new keys. I got in, started the engine, and heard the smooth hum like a quiet breath. I drove out of the lot. After just the first few laps, my heart raced like the first time I learned to drive as a young woman. No more clattering, no more fear of stalling. It was a genuine feeling of freedom. That evening, I sat at my computer and found a tour website for a trip my husband and I had often talked about, but never had the chance to take: a scenic trip to Alaska. I looked at pictures of snowy mountains, blue seas, and small ships crossing the bays. I missed my husband so much. We had said, after the kids grow up, we'll take a long trip, but we never got to do it. I took a deep breath and clicked to book the trip. When I completed the payment, it felt like I had fulfilled a promise that had been left unfinished for both of us. That night, I sat in the living room, looking at the new grocery bags, the trip confirmation, and the brochures for the new apartment I had decided to move into. All of it made me realize one thing: I was coming back to life. Not because of the money alone, but because, for the first time in many years, I could fully take care of myself. I felt more at peace, as if I had finally escaped the stretch of life spent constantly juggling worries and loneliness. After regaining my composure and arranging plans for my new life, I began to think about my 3 children. I wondered, Were they truly so strapped that they couldn't afford to buy me a few bags of groceries? Or were they simply too busy and thoughtless? I wanted to understand so I would know how to treat them going forward. I didn't hire a private investigator or take any elaborate measures. I just opened my computer and did what most people do. I checked my children's social media profiles and public information related to their work. Mark's page came up first. His most recent post was a photo of the family at a sunny Miami beach. Mark's daughter was holding a large coconut drink, and Mark stood behind, flexing and smiling proudly. Below that was another post. The house Mark was listing for sale, worth many times more than my old home. I scrolled down further and saw the new fish tank in his living room. Mark's caption read, "Treating myself after a productive month." Next, I went to Rachel's page. The first photo was her new kitchen, full of shiny appliances. Rachel wrote, "Finally finished my dream kitchen." Below that were pictures of her family at an art exhibition and dining at an upscale Italian restaurant. I read the comments, friends praising her taste and how she knows how to enjoy life. Then I opened Evan's page. His profile picture showed him at the helm of his new yacht, wind in his hair and a radiant smile. There was even a video he posted just weeks ago, showing friends laughing and having fun on that boat. I also found public information about his tax consulting office. Last year's revenue looked solid, with an increase. I sat there, screen glowing in the quiet room, hearing the ticking of the clock. Each image felt like a small slice of the comfortable lives they led. Mark, Rachel, and Evan all had means. They were enjoying their own lives. I wasn't jealous. I felt choked. A strange sensation, as if someone had just pressed deep into my chest. I remembered standing in the supermarket, returning a pack of meat because I was a few dollars short. I remembered opening the empty refrigerator and then sitting for an hour, summoning the courage to call each of them. I closed my laptop and sighed. At that moment, I understood very clearly one thing. My children weren't lacking money. They were lacking concern. And that hurt me more than any hardship I had ever endured. One Saturday morning, I called Mark and invited him and his family for lunch. His voice sounded a bit surprised but cheerful. "Sure, Mom. It's been a while since we all ate with you." I prepared pot roast, his favorite dish since he was a little boy. I used to make it often when he was energetic and always running around the house, then sitting still at mealtime just to wait for the smell of tender meat filling the kitchen. When Mark and his family walked into the house, the atmosphere was initially warm and inviting. Mark's daughter ran over and hugged my legs, and Mark said with a smile, "I've missed this dish so much, Mom." We had lunch while chatting lightly. Mark shared some stories about work, and Claire asked if I'd been well. I responded normally, keeping the mood as warm as they seemed to want it to be. After clearing the table and pouring more tea, I looked at Mark and spoke directly. "Mark, I have something I need to tell you." He stiffened a little. I went on. "I received a notice of inheritance. A relative in Seattle left me $3,900,000. Mark's eyes widened. Claire froze for a moment. I looked at him and said slowly, "That day when I asked you for a little food, do you remember? You told me to eat less to save money." The mood in the room shifted instantly. Mark stared down at the table. I took my phone and opened his posts. Pictures of the Miami trip, the new fish tank, the fancy gatherings. I wasn't accusing him. I simply showed them to him. "I see your life is stable. You're not struggling. I know you're busy, but what you said that day, it hurt me." Mark swallowed and spoke quietly. "Mom, I'm sorry. I said it without thinking. I didn't know things were so hard for you." I nodded gently. "I know, but I need to be clear about something. From now on, I won't babysit for free anymore. You and Claire have the means to manage." Mark looked like he wanted to respond, but didn't know where to start. In the end, he only repeated, "Mom, I really am sorry." I gave him a soft smile. "I'm not angry. I just want to live for myself a little." No one said anything else, but I knew Mark understood. A few days later, I called Rachel for dinner. I cooked chicken soup, her favorite dish when she was in high school. When Rachel walked into the house, she immediately smiled. "Wow, Mom, you haven't made this in ages." The atmosphere was warm at first. Rachel discussed her work, her long shifts, and the kids' progress in school. She spoke with more warmth than usual. When we finished eating and moved on to tea, I finally said, "Rachel, I have something to tell you." She looked at me, tilting her head as if she sensed what was coming. I inherited $3,900,000. Rachel set her teacup down, her hand slightly trembling. "Mom, what?" I briefly explained the letter, the lawyer, and Uncle Harold. Then I said, "That day when I called asking for a little help with groceries, you told me to cook cheap meals and stop buying expensive things. Do you remember?" Rachel bit her lip. "Mom, I was so busy that day. I didn't think things were that bad." I looked at her, my voice without blame. "I don't need your money. I just needed a little concern. What you said that day hurt me deeply." Rachel lowered her head, eyes reddening. "I'm sorry, Mom. I was wrong." I gently held her hand. "I know you care about me, but I've been the one arranging all the family gatherings for years. From now on, you should take care of those. Your house is bigger, nicer. You can handle it." Rachel broke down in real tears. I rubbed her shoulder. "I'm not angry. I just want a lighter, easier life." Evan was the one who came with the most worry. When I invited him, he asked twice if something was wrong. When he arrived, Evan sat at the table looking tense. I served meatloaf, his childhood favorite. He smiled slightly when he saw it, though his eyes still revealed unease. After we finished eating, I said, "Evan, I need to talk to you." He set his fork down and waited. I inherited nearly $4 million. Evan stayed silent for a few seconds, then exhaled hard. I heard from Mark, but I didn't think it was that big." I nodded. "That day, when I called asking for a little food, you told me to control my spending, and your wife said older people don't need to eat much." Evan immediately bowed his head. "Mom, I'm sorry. I really am. I've regretted it all week." I spoke clearly but gently. That comment hurt me. Not because of the money. I just felt unappreciated. Evan looked at me, eyes red. "Mom, please let me make it right. I mean it." I smiled kindly. "I've forgiven you. I'm not angry, but I need time. I want to live comfortably without depending on anyone." He nodded over and over. "I just want you to understand how I felt. That's all." Evan held my hand for a long moment. There was still distance, but at least I knew he truly understood. Those 3 meals didn't make everything perfect between my children and me, but they allowed me to say things I had kept inside for years, finally, and they helped my children see how they had treated the mother who had spent her entire life caring for them. I will be moving into my new apartment at the beginning of next month. It was a small 2-room place, bright, clean, and much warmer than my old house. The window overlooked a shared garden where a few older adults were always reading newspapers or taking gentle walks. Every morning, the staff would stop by to check whether anyone needed assistance. I felt more secure, more at ease. During my first week, I signed up for the drawing club in the community room. I had never studied art formally, but holding a pencil and sitting in a quiet space made my mind feel lighter. A few people around my age introduced themselves to me. A woman named Margaret loved telling stories about her grandchild. A man named Leonard often cracked jokes to make everyone laugh. I no longer felt the loneliness I had carried. Every day I set aside time to read or walk around the grounds. I cooked dishes I enjoyed, took care of my skin, drank tea at the right hours, and slept enough. Small things, but things I hadn't had the heart or peace of mind to do before. Now each day felt gentler and worth living. Then came the trip. Standing on the ship heading toward Alaska, looking out at the endless water, I suddenly felt my heart open after all those years. The snow-covered mountains, the clean air, the soft sound of the waves. Everything reminded me of my husband and the promise we never fulfilled. I stood at the bow for a long time, taking a deep breath and realizing I was truly alive again. No more worry, no more burdens, only the peace I had lost for so long. During that time, my children would often call. Mark called to apologize, asking if I wanted him to pick me up each week. Rachel texted, sent me photos of food, and asked if I would join their family dinners again. Evan called even more frequently than the other two, always starting with, "Mom, are you doing okay?" I listened to all of it, but I no longer depended on anyone. I replied gently and politely while maintaining my boundaries. I wasn't in a rush to return to being the mother who was always available and always helping. I appreciated their affection, but I chose my own peace first. And for the first time in many years, I felt that my life no longer revolved around old worries. I could finally live the way I wanted. One weekend afternoon, I called all 3 of my children and invited them to a small restaurant downtown. It wasn't fancy, but it was quiet and warm. I wanted this meeting to be simple, not showy, just a meal to say what I needed to say. Mark arrived first. He looked around the table, then sat down, appearing a bit uneasy. Rachel arrived next, adjusting her blouse repeatedly, her face tense. Evan came last, walking in with a slightly nervous look, as if afraid of doing something wrong. When all 3 were settled, I simply smiled and asked, "How are you, dear ones?" They all answered, "We're fine," at the same time, but none of them looked truly calm. They knew I was about to say something important. When the food arrived, I began telling them about my new life. I spoke about the peaceful apartment, the drawing club, my new friends, and the Alaska trip that reminded me I still had so much to live for. "Ever since I moved, I felt so relieved," I said. "Every morning I wake up feeling peaceful. I don't worry so much anymore." The 3 of them stared at me without looking away. In their eyes, I saw a bit of surprise, a bit of confusion, and a quiet guilt they tried to hide. I set down my glass and continued. Slowly, but clearly. I invited you here today because I want to tell you something important. The air around the table seemed to sink. No one spoke. I have used most of the inheritance to establish a charity fund. It's called the Kind Hands Fund. I allocated $3.5 million so it can operate long-term. Rachel covered her mouth. Mark frowned. Evan looked straight at me. Unable to hide his shock, I explained. This fund helps elderly people who struggle with food insecurity, just like what I went through. Each month, the fund will support them in buying food, basic medicine, and essential items. No one said a word. Silence wrapped around the table, a silence complete with thought. I looked at each of my children, my voice soft but firm. That day when I needed a little help, just a little, I didn't get it. I felt left behind. I don't want any elderly person to feel that, so I want to use this money to help them. Mark lowered his head, his hands clasped together. Rachel couldn't hold back her tears. Evan stared at his plate, lips pressed tight. I wasn't blaming them. I wasn't resentful. I was simply saying what needed to be said. I didn't establish this fund to make anyone feel guilty. I did it because I understand the loneliness of the elderly. I just want the money to go to the right people, the ones who truly need it. After a long moment, Mark finally spoke, his voice strained. "Mom, we're sorry." Rachel wiped her tears, and Evan only sighed, unable to put anything into words. I stood up and smiled gently. "I'm not angry. I just want to live peacefully. You all live your own lives. When you want to see me, call me. I'll always be here." I paid for the meal and hugged each of them before leaving the restaurant. When I stepped outside, the air was cool and the breeze soft. My heart felt strangely light. No more heaviness, no more hurt, only the peace I had long waited for. My story ends here. There's nothing grand about it, just the journey of an old mother finding peace for herself. but I hope that if you've listened all the way to this part, you'll understand something important. Respecting your parents is not a luxury, it is a necessity. It's the foundation that keeps a family standing. A simple question, a short visit, or even a small message is enough to warm an elderly heart. Small acts of kindness can sometimes save someone from loneliness and despair. They cost nothing, take little effort, yet their value is immeasurable. Throughout life, what parents need most isn't gifts or material things. What they long for is the feeling of being remembered, valued, and loved. And when we act with care, when we put a bit of thought before speaking or doing something, life naturally becomes gentler for us and for those around us. If you still have your parents, call them. You don't need to say anything grand. Just say, "I miss you," or "Are you doing okay?" And it will make their whole day. As for me, I've found peace in my later years, and I hope other older adults will also receive what they deserve: sincere care and compassion,